That's clear. And I think with that, we can talk about what you are starting to talk. And I think it's the conversation about, on one end is deductibles, but on the other end is the claim. Before we talk about actually doing the claim, etc., because I want to maybe talk about considerations. So you are starting to say like, okay, there is a $2,000 damage to the property, something minor. Let's say, I don't know, there is some kind of sump pump failure, some local damage, and $2,000. What would be the consideration to claim or not to claim? What are the pros and cons in terms of considering whether to file and claim on such rough, let's say, tag amount of damage, $2,000?
It's just insurance should be used on claims that are like larger than that. You don't, if a house has like claims, first, it's important to note one thing. Claims follow the property, not the owner. So it's about the house, like the claim stays on file with the actual address of the house. It's the property itself. So sometimes they'll have an extra higher rate because there was a claim there and you may not have known about it. But going back to the main point, I just wanted to kind of touch on that because it's important to know that it's not the actual person's name, but it's actually the address of the house. Mm-hmm. So, and with any claim though, you just want to use it on larger claims. It's, you might, like if you file a bunch of little claims, they're going to cancel you and then you won't be able to get insured by anyone, or it'll be like a ton of more money. So like, that's why you don't do these little claims where it's only going to pay out, $500, $600, $700. Like, try to take care of it. And a lot of times, if you have a good property management company and they know people, they can do it for a lot less than like what the insurance adjuster says it would cost. So it's just not worth it in the long run. You'll see a short-term payout, but then over time with the rates, or you maybe will get canceled, your rate will go up. Like you'll end up paying for that. And so if it's not more than so much money, it's not worth it. Like,
so the more the claims on the property, the subject is like the property itself. The more claims on a property, the more it would be expensive or even difficult to get your property insured in the future.
In some cases, it's uninsurable, and you have to actually rehab the house and wait to get insurance and hope that nothing happens.
And what people need to understand is that this is kind of a closed shared system. It's not like, you're insured with one carrier and then you go to another carrier, but this information is shared.
They all see it. It's all linked. So like, yeah, if there's been a ton of claims, no one's going to touch a certain house. You know what I mean? If it has 5 claims in 2 years.
Good. So that's one consideration. And we're continuing the conversation about consideration. So there is another, I think maybe main or important consideration, a very frequently asked question, which you start mentioning a few times. And I'm talking about the programs, the rental programs, the DP or DF1, 2, and 3. Can you talk now a bit about the consideration for taking one rather than the other? What would be the consideration? Before the recommendation here or there, what would be the consideration? The pros and cons for each program.
What do you mean exactly?
Like, why a person should consider DP3? What are the pros of DP3 versus DP2 or DP1? On the contrary, or maybe in addition, what would be the pros to consider the DP2? What would be the pros, or what would be a scenario for someone to consider DP1? For example, someone has, 100 properties. So this is something I want to hear from you about the, let's say, features or pros
yeah, I understand now. You want me to kind of get so for a DP1 or dwelling fire 1, as you'll see them referred to, basically the benefit there is just cost. They're going to cost you $300 to $400, maybe $500 for the year. You can tack on some extra, coverages and stuff because it's so cheap, but it only covers the trade-off there with the low cost is you're only really covered for like 2 or 3 things, which is essentially all just fire. It's explosion, fire, and lightning, but it's all just fire. So that's a DP1. Like I said, I don't recommend them, but if you, in the situation where you have maybe 15 properties and you need to get them all insured quickly, maybe you get a DP1 for the first year, until you figure out which ones you're selling and whatnot. And it's just because you have so many that'll keep the cost down. Now, realistically, I do the least overall of DP1s. I know Jeff, who used to work with, tried to sell them all the time because they were cheap, but they're just not good. And then DP2s is nice because it's kind of in the middle. You get the best of both worlds. You get a little bit cheaper, a lot cheaper actually than a DP3. It's going to be between the cheapest DP2 I've seen is like $550. I'd say the most expensive was like, if it's a triplex or a duplex, this does not apply, $1,000. It's going to be, anytime you have a triplex or duplex with any of these policies, expect the rate to double or triple because you're getting that much more rent and it's that much more risk. It's common sense.
Yeah.
So then for DP2, you're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting the lower cost, but you're getting all these perils covered. But it's named perils. So that's why I always name all those perils out in the email. So that each investor knows what the perils are on that DP2. The only difference between a DP2 and a DP3 is that a DP3 is much more expensive, but it's open perils, meaning it might even cover things that might normally be excluded. Like it's like just the most perils you can have. It's open. It's called open perils versus named. So basically on a DP2, it's a little cheaper and everything in there is named. A DP3, they may cover something that's not named in the policy because it's open perils.
Mm-hmm.
So the DP3 is the best. It's like it's the Titan of all of them. It's expensive. It's amazing. There's so many extra coverages too that I can't even click. Like if I do a DP2 for one of you, I can't even click some of these coverage options because they're not there except for on a DP3. If you want, like, if you have a super nice property, you know, something like that, you want a DP3, but it's rare. You have to just really have someone almost who's paranoid to get a DP3.
Yeah, it's like saying one thing is all the things that we can list, or, you know, a lot of things that are named in the DP2, but DP3, someone can say, well, a lot of things can happen and we didn't even think about it. So for this kind of people, you would say, well, you have everything there, of course, with some kind of...
if you really care about the house, the insurance company is going to give you a lot more slack and goodwill, and you have those open perils. There may be some, it's open to interpretation with the DP3. So if you really care about the house or potentially even have a family member living in it or something like that, get that DP3. Because I do see that a lot of times I'll have a family member living there. So instead of like getting a homeowners, because you can't, they'll get a glorified homeowners by writing a very expensive, nice DP3. Just because they, you know, it's like the house that their son or their daughter may be living in.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. One more thing that I want to ask you, and you mentioned when you were talking about like listing what is what with the loss of rents, liability, you know, going through that. I wanted to talk with you about maybe some, for me through the years, you know, many years, I'm in real estate for 10 years. You mentioned like hundreds of properties that only we work together. So I got a lot of questions through the years. And I saw some kind of misconception, for example, for the loss of rents, like for people saying, oh, great, I have loss of rents. I have the property occupied. Someone goes out and then maybe it takes me 3 months to rent the property. You know, they perceive it as risk. So I can receive the loss rent when the property is vacant, which of course is not true. So I think this is an example of some kind of misconception. And I want to have like your explanation for people to understand when there is a loss of rents, it doesn't mean you get the lost rent in any case, but just in specific case, and explain like how it's related to the perils. Like
it's the same as it works for a dwelling. I mean, it's a coverage. So loss of rent is a coverage that only applies when there's a date and time of loss. There's tenants living in the house within. No, they had to be, if they had just moved out, it wouldn't even count. So like realistically, if there's a fire and there's tenants living there and they can't live there anymore because of the fire, as long as those repairs take, as long as it takes, that's how much loss of rent you would get. But you can't just get loss of rent on a vacant property, David. No insurance company will do that. That's a very common misconception. I have heard it before.
Yeah.
Also important to note with that question, with the vacant properties, these policies will cover them if they're vacant for up to like, it's like 45 or 60 days. So like if you're going to be rehabbing for more than 2 months, that's when we do a vacant policy.
Yes. And that's the point I wanted to touch. And thank you for bringing this up, because sometimes, you know, when we think about rental property, there is the natural vacancy or, you know, the tenant replacement. So sometimes maybe after when investor purchase a property, there is the vacancy because he's making the property rent ready. So let's say I'm about to purchase a property. When do I start the insurance process? And considering it might be an occupied property versus a vacant property. Can you talk about these scenarios? When would you start the process? Which insurance you would buy? And then when will you switch?
Honestly, that's a really hard one to give you a concrete answer, a simple concrete answer on. I would take it situation by situation, but as a simple rule of thumb, and I'm not going to tell you this is 100% certainty, but most of the time this will work. If you're trying to get tenants moving in and it's not a flip and the rehab is going to take less than like 2 months, I would say just write a normal policy. And if you read through the policy documents, coverage will lower when it's vacant, like a little bit, but it's still covered.
Yeah.
And sometimes it gets to, and you want to do it correctly. Sometimes you get lucky and the inspector doesn't notice it's vacant, or they don't inspect the house for a couple months, which happens. That's just part of the whole insurance thing. When are they going to inspect it? What are they going to find? Now for a vacant property, it's really the ones that are going to be really long rehabs as a simple rule of thumb. If it's a really long rehab, or there's weather and there's delays, like that's when you get a vacant policy. Something that's, let's say, more than 2.5 months, more than 2 months. Then, and what's nice about the vacant policies is you can actually convert those into a normal policy in Foremost, or we can do a rewrite in State Auto or one of the other companies. But for overall rates right now, Foremost and State Auto seem to be the best. I've been shopping the rates around a lot lately just to get you guys some better ones. But for the overseas investors, State Auto really doesn't mind. And a lot of companies aren't a huge fan of that.
So I think you really touched on something that we talk a lot per each project. Okay, what are we doing in this project? And we always check it case by case. What is the estimated rehab duration? Usually, if it's a short rehab, we would just start with a regular standard rental property or landlord insurance to do it. So I think it's great to really capture the, let's say, the rules of thumb for how we do it. So thank you for sharing it.